Hello, everyone. Welcome back to FTF Coffee Breaks. Thank you for joining us for our cybersecurity lessons from the lockdown episode. I'm Maureen Lowe. I'm founder and president of FTF. I will also be one of your co-hosts today, along with my one and only trusted Chief Content Officer, Eugene Grigo. You can see we are also joined by our panel of experts today. We have Joe Kroll from IT Group, Milan Patel from Blue Voyant, and Greg Markovich from FINRA. As I said, this is our fourth episode of FTF Coffee Breaks. We are running this virtual series through August 19th. If you joined us last week, we were talking about all things financial crime stemming from COVID-19. So today's episode is a great follow-up to that discussion where we are going to delve further into cybersecurity specifically. So in today's discussion, we are going to be focusing on new trends that are cybersecurity trends stemming from the current pandemic. We'll be discussing cyber security, hack attacks, ransomware, email systems that are being set up from home, cloud-based email systems, and misconfiguration that might cause security concerns, third-party vendor risk, identity theft and phishing, and budget predictions for 2021. So if we haven't scared you off already, we have lots of interesting things to talk about today. You'll see that we have a chat feature enabled where we do encourage you to interact with us today. It makes for a lot more interesting discussion. So if you have any comments for your peers or you comments on anything that we're saying or a question that you would like us to throw out, I am going to be facilitating a lot of what's coming in from the audience. So if you see a question in particular that you like, give it a thumbs up. And that's how I'll know that you would like me to ask that question. Greg has also supplied some materials for you that you might want to take a look at before you leave today. A couple of links on the FINRA site that supply information about cybersecurity and guides and tips. So be sure to check those out. Once the live stream of this episode ends, the chat feature is disabled, so you're not able to click on it after, but I'm happy to send them around after the event. So please do interact with us today. My co-host Eugene is going to get started shortly on the bulk of the discussions, but before we do that, I would just like to take a moment and have the guests introduce themselves. So Greg, why don't you kick us off?
Okay, thank you, Maureen, and good morning, everyone. My name is Greg Markovich. I work for the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, or FINRA. I'm sure many of the participants today are familiar with FINRA. We are a self-regulatory organization for broker-dealers in the US. And many of the broker-dealers that we work with are also registered investment advisors. Some are banks, some are insurance companies. So we get to work with lots of different financial services companies all across the US. And I'm on a team at FINRA. We're focused on cybersecurity and technology. And we do three things. We do reviews at member firms. So we'll go out to firms and we'll look at their cybersecurity programs and controls. We also work with firms after they've had a cybersecurity incident, and that part of our job has grown exponentially, especially in the last 12 months. I think, in the first quarter of this year, we had as many cybersecurity incidents at FINRA firms as we did all of last year. So it's grown pretty considerably this year. And then we also do training both for internal FINRA staff and for FINRA member firms. I did want to mention too, one of the things we've been trying to do, Maureen mentioned that there's some links that I provided. We're trying to build out a website that's helpful to really anyone, including the member firms. But if you go to finra.org/cybersecurity, on our website, we've provided number of different materials that I hope you'll find to be helpful. One is just some general white papers on cybersecurity, some of the controls, what we look for when we come into a financial firm and we look at their program. We also provide what I hope are timely notices. So some recent examples would be, we did post a notice related to fraudulent activities that we're seeing as COVID-19 has impacted all of us and we've all moved to work from home. There's also some other good notices out there. Just a couple I'll mention. One about cloud-based email systems and account takeovers that we're seeing there, as well as imposter websites. There's also a small firm checklist. If you're a smaller firm, you're looking for a risk assessment tool, we have one of those out there. And then finally, we do have a compliance vendor directory. While FINRA doesn't endorse any particular technology or software companies, we do provide a list of some of the companies that we see, and they're grouped by different categories. So,
okay, so we're done. No, just kidding.
That's all we need.
Everyone else, could they introduce themselves?
Go ahead, Joe.
Good morning. Joe Kroll from IT Group. IT Group is an independent research company that's been serving the financial services industry for about 15 years. We kicked off a cybersecurity practice in 2019, and I joined. I'm about to come up on 45 years in information security. I was an operations officer for the Defense Intelligence Agency, and then later a chief information security officer for four Global 1000 companies, and as a consultant for some large consulting companies. And now I have the opportunity to work with financial services institutions and technology providers and consulting firms and kind of give our points of view and do research around fintech, insurtech, and really just about everything that makes the money make the world go round. So it's an honor to be here today.
And you're based in Israel?
I split my time between Tel Aviv, Israel, and San Antonio, Texas.
Oh, okay.
And last but not least, Milan.
Hi, everyone. My name is Milan Patel. Currently run the managed services business at Bluepoint, which is a cybersecurity company based in New York City. Prior to this, was the chief technology officer of the FBI Cyber Division. And prior to that was a senior special agent with the FBI in New York City, working cybercrime and among other matters. We spend a lot of time with financial services companies. We support over 200 financial services institutions on 24/7 security operations, as well as compliance, understanding what they have today and how it responds to specific controls around cybersecurity for some of the major regulatory regimes like FFIEC and CUA and others. Thank you.
Okay. Just very quickly, the COVID-19 pandemic is compelling financial services firms to restrict their staffs to working remotely. For many, this is the first time that they have ever worked from home. And this has meant greater dependence upon internet technologies and web-based conferencing systems and messaging systems. But there is a trade-off. Remote staffing can present security vulnerabilities and logistical challenges. For the first question, like, how are operations staffs responding to this, what many have perceived as a new wave of cyber attacks upon securities firms? How are ops teams, are they working closely with cybersecurity staffs and others?
So I'll take that one. Yeah, what was really interesting is I'm pretty sure that the business continuity and disaster recovery plans did not have 100% working remotely. The continuity plans usually they would provide services from an alternative location. But when everybody's locked out and shelter in place, it really creates logistical and cyber issues. In the beginning, we saw a lot of cybersecurity staff or professionals pulled away from their normal jobs to just help with things like configurations and getting people set up and getting VPNs and remote access done. And in some cases, provisioning computers. Folks didn't have laptops. So we heard stories of folks making high-speed drive-bys and picking up laptops in parking lots and speeding home and then getting on the phone and trying to configure those things. The other thing that we saw early on in the pandemic was that the IT teams didn't have good alternative ways to contact users if for some reason their machines were infected or they were locked out or their email didn't work. So there was a big push to try to figure out how do we contact our workforce. And this brought cyber and ops people into the same game to try to update those records. We saw some issues with help desk because help desk can get involved not only in normal day-to-day IT issues, but help desk is usually one of the first organizations that gets involved when there's a cyber incident or an anomaly. People will contact the help desk. And when you're dispersed and you're all over, coordination becomes quite difficult. But now that we're months into this pandemic, the organizations have adjusted to those patterns. Lots of folks are using personally owned devices, whether it's smartphones or laptops or whatever, iPads, tablet computers, and that creates a whole nother issue with configuration and management and vulnerability management and patching. And finally, one of the things we're seeing that's continuing to be a problem between operations and cyber is when a machine is infected for any reason, the usual best practice is to re-image that machine and not try to remove the malware from it, because the malware goes deep into the operating system and it's very hard to eradicate it. Well, how do you re-image machines when people are working from home? So again, this is where cyber and ops are coming together to try to provide those services and keep the network and keep business flowing.
And maybe a thought that I would add here to Joe's comments is that, in the past, many of us have kind of taken a position where we'll make a statement that, I'm not really that technical and I rely on my help desk, and if something goes wrong on my machine, I just pick the phone up and call them. But I think in today's environment, the bar's kind of been raised for all of us. We all have to have some technical prowess. If you're going to connect with a device that isn't provided to you and you're going to connect on your network at home, you really do have to take some responsibility and learn a little bit about your home network. For example, you need to be able to log into your router. You need to be able to check your firmware and make sure that it's up to date. You need to know whether or not your antivirus, anti-malware is active on your device. And so the days where we could get away with, well, I'm not really that technical and I just rely on the help desk, they're really behind us. And all of us need to take more responsibility for learning more about security and in some ways become a little bit of a security admin in our home environments, especially if we're using our own devices.
And at least understand the terms, right? Even if you can't
Exactly.
fix them, right? Milan?
I think it was summed up really well. I think that the challenge we saw was, help desk is used to walking down the hall and fixing a problem, and now they can't. Exactly what Joe said, and that's presented, issues that was just brought up, but also downtime, right? An employee can't fix their own computer, and they're waiting for a new computer to be shipped out to them. I don't know if anybody's noticed, but Amazon Prime is telling everybody that they can't do 2-day shipping because they're shipping other things that are more relevant. And so computers don't qualify as, things that you need for your household. And so we've seen routine delays for our own employees in our administrative teams. When their laptop goes down, we send them a new one. And sometimes it takes 5, 6, 7 days to send a laptop, depending on where they are in the world. And so that has become increasingly complicated. And all our customers, by the way, are facing the exact same issue.
Mm-hmm. And Murray, we have a question from the audience.
Yes, we do. They're asking what's new for lockdown versus standard cyber issues that were in place pre-COVID-19?
I could take this. There's a bunch of new stuff, I guess. You could call it new, but it's not necessarily new. I think we were going to bring this up on a question later on in the panel, but really when we talk about security, generally speaking, organizations have provided pretty good perimeter security by way of firewalls and other technologies to prevent users from getting access to things they shouldn't. Bad websites, known malicious websites. And when you're home and those technologies no longer apply because you're not connected to the network at the office, routing your internet traffic through the corporate network out to the internet, you're now on an island where you can access anything you want. And so what we're seeing is an uptick in phishing attacks that are more distributed. And so the technologies that were used to protect you from a sort of centralized layer now have to be filtered down to individual machines. And so the technology vendors that are producing these technologies have to start pushing software-based approaches directly to the machine to enable that same level of protection that they would have gotten if they were in a corporate office behind a firewall, behind an intrusion detection system. And so that has been a huge change. Our customers have felt it, and we're seeing attacks of our customer base that are non-routine, meaning the bad guys have figured out that it's easier to target these individuals while home rather than in the office, because there's a good chance the firewall is going to stop them from getting in on their first 5 tries. And so that's been a big change for us. And the types of alerts we see are indicative of that.
Okay. All right,
Okay,
so,
great. We actually had one more question from the audience, if I can just step in. They're asking, I think this is for you, Greg, has FINRA or another regulator taken a view on what types of communication should be encrypted, trading data versus PII versus stuff you just email? Obviously more complicated now that everybody has worked from home.
Yeah, no, great question. And, we definitely suggest to firms that you encrypt all sensitive or confidential data that's transmitted via the internet, an outbound email, or if there's an application system that a firm has that's going to send and receive sensitive information, we would definitely suggest that be encrypted. I mean, one of the tools that we see emerging, it fits into the category of data loss prevention tools. I'll just use the cloud-based email systems because that's kind of a simple example, but Office 365, Gmail, they all have the ability now to scan outbound emails and to identify sensitive information in either the text in an email or an attachment. So you think about things like account numbers, whether they're bank account numbers or an account number at a financial firm. You think about Social Security or tax ID number. With a little bit of work, you can configure your system to scan and identify sensitive information and then make sure that it's being sent encrypted. And if it can't go encrypted for some reason, which sometimes it can if the receiving email system doesn't support it, which there really aren't a lot anymore. But if for some reason the transmission can't go encrypted, there's a couple of alternatives. One is you can just block the transmission, and another one is you can force the recipient to log back in to see the email through an encrypted session. So the answer definitely here is any sensitive confidential information, whether it's personally identifiable information or trade data or other, confidential information. Sometimes it's intellectual property. All should be encrypted when it's sent.
There's a good point there. For RIAs and brokers who may not have huge infrastructure. Maybe they're always working out of the home. Windows or Mac allow you to have native encryption on both those operating systems. Windows calls it BitLocker and Mac calls it File Vault. Both of those can be enabled and turned on. Both are able to run the newest versions of antivirus. And you can also turn on syncing and encryption on O365, which is Microsoft's version of cloud-based email, and G Suite, which is Google's version of email. And so you can actually have a layer of encryption and a layer of security to put yourself in a defensible position right out of the box. You don't need to buy new things. You don't need to do any of these things because they're natively available. You just got to use them.
And then Greg, the gentleman who asked the question was and saying, in regards to email, were you referring to P2P, like TLS? I hope those are acronyms I'm not familiar with, but.
Yeah, so point-to-point and transport layer security, right? I mean, that's pretty much the internet standard protocol for encrypting emails that go out. So yeah, you want to be using the most current release level of TLS. But as Milan and I highlighted, Office 365, G Suite, they're gonna try to use the most current version of TLS. So if you rely on Microsoft, if you rely on some of the other common operating systems, you're typically gonna get the most current standards. So you should be safe there.
Yeah, that's a good segue to our next question. Like, what are some of the new threats from hackers and others that financial services firms have to keep an eye out for?
Yeah, and really, I'll start this question off. I'm sure my colleagues will have some other thoughts, but I would almost start with, it's not so much the new threats. It's the threats that have been around for a long time, just with new twists that the fraudsters are adding to them. And so, as we work
And
with
what are some of those new twists?
yeah, so we'll talk about that. So, I mean, first of all, what I would say is as we work with financial service firms across the country, the number one threat that we're seeing are phishing emails. Usually with a goal of either dropping some type of malware on a desktop when you click on a link, or compromising account credentials. And so the new twist on phishing is, you have phishing emails that are organized around COVID and the pandemic. So whether they're cures or, causes that need to be invested in, it's very, very creative. I think domain name registrations related to COVID, quadrupled in the first quarter of 2020. So a lot of the phishing emails now are just based around what's happening. We've got an election this year. It's another big focus of the phishing emails. So phishing emails, account takeovers leading to fraudulent wires, some type of money movement really is the number one thing that we're seeing across FINRA financial firms. We also continue to see ransomware, and there are some new variants of ransomware. You may have heard the term maze is one. So now it's not enough that the fraudsters, encrypt all your data and charge you or want to charge you a ransom for you to be able to get your data back, but they also take a copy of the data and they send it out, to the fraudster, and then the fraudster can hold that data for ransom as well. So, even if you unencrypt all the data in your internal network so you can view it again, the fraudster still has a copy that they can threaten to release to the public if you don't pay the fee. So that's sort of a new twist.
And you said maze. How is that spelled?
MAZE.
Okay.
Yeah, and then the last one I'll mention, and I'll let my colleagues kind of weigh in here too, because I know they have a lot of experience with this as well. But imposter websites are something that we're seeing, and it's kind of ebbed and flowed. But here recently, again, we're seeing a large number of imposter websites. So a fraudster will stand up a website that the name is very close to an actual financial services firm. Maybe it's one letter off, or an added phrase, but just at a glance, it appears to be another financial firm. And then they can do various things with those imposter websites. One is you can stand up an email server, and now you can send an email that appears to be from a legitimate financial firm. The other thing is they're used in other types of frauds. A lot of times they'll copy content from the legitimate site. They'll make it look just like the legitimate site, and then they'll refer to it in a phishing email or an email that's trying to solicit fraudulent funds. So FINRA did issue a notice, by the way, last year on imposter websites. There's some steps you can take, one of which is just to try to register all the variants of your legitimate website name to try to prevent hackers from being able to steal those from you.
Hey, Eugene, now that everybody's working from home, one we found was kind of a threat surface that had been overlooked by many. But if you're working on particularly sensitive information like mergers and acquisitions or account information or very sensitive PII or medical things, you probably want to turn off all those virtual voice assistants that are turned on from Amazon, from Apple, from Google, that are listening as you're conducting business in your home office. So just one more step, turn those things off before you start working on highly sensitive data.
Mm-hmm. And they listen and they record, and then people can access that information?
Well, they're listening all the time. They're waiting for wake-up words. But we saw last year there were many vulnerabilities where conversations that people thought they were having in confidence had been recorded in the cloud and had been accessed by others that had no business listening to those conversations. So it's a potential vulnerability, but it's better to be safe than sorry.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So what are some of the common cybersecurity pitfalls that firms should try to avoid? And this is as they are, of course, working remotely.
Yeah, so I think, more broadly, what we generally see from smaller institutions, so smaller banks, credit unions, RIAs, and others, hiding the herd or sort of security through obscurity. And the reality is that the bad guys have figured out that targeting a multinational bank is a lot of work. I've had the fortunate and unfortunate pleasure of interviewing many people we arrested over the years. And I've been told by hackers we've arrested on the other side of the world that we just stopped targeting Citibank because they just spend too much money on security. It takes forever to get in. And we don't really see a big return on it. And I carried this phrase with me for the last 10 years. I had a Eastern European gentleman tell me that $1 from that company is the same dollar from this company. And that means a lot. They're thinking about this is a business for them. They run a criminal enterprise. There's marketing teams. There's a CEO. There's a front company. These are not people in their basement anymore. This is full-blown enterprise. I wish I could share some pictures with you I've taken over the years of buildings that were front companies running a cybercrime operation globally inside, completely fraudulent. And what we learned is over the last 5 to 10 years, they've really realized that the ROI going after 60 smaller companies is way better than going after Morgan Stanley that spends $400 million a year on cybersecurity outside of the IT budget. Most organizations don't have that kind of budget, and smaller ones surely don't, meaning they don't even have a CIO or a CISO or anybody technical. They're usually outsourcing some of these capabilities. And so the biggest pitfall I see for any organization, whether you're working from home or not, is the fact that you think, it's not going to be me. I had a conversation with a private equity last week. We were talking about cybersecurity and cybercrime, and they had some organizations that they felt that weren't great targets for attack. And 3 days later, we get a call from one of their portfolio companies that got ransomware, encrypted every machine on the network, the backups, and the ransom was $2 million. And so you can imagine what that does to the bottom line, paying a $2 million ransom. And yes, my team will negotiate and figure out if we can get a lower rate from the bad guys because they offer a customer service portal through the dark web, and you can negotiate with them. But the reality is that nobody's immune to this, no matter how small you are. And if you're working from home, your threat surface is increased. What we sort of often consider knowledge workers are the people that are connected to the business, responsible for generating revenue or running operations. Those individuals are now spread across multiple states, countries, working for the same company. And the bad guys know this. If you look at intelligence we're collecting, even at our company in the dark web, we're finding the bad guys talking about better techniques to go after work and home employees, targeting their social media accounts, figuring out specific things about somebody's profile. As a great example, we see bad guys targeting senior executives of companies and sending them LinkedIn messages saying, "Hey, I loved your presentation," because who doesn't want to say that they were giving a great presentation at some webinar, some other place, and then you send the link and tell me a person who just didn't do a large audience presentation would not open a link from somebody who's congratulating them how well they did. The reality is that happens every day, and the bad guys have figured out that's the best way to do it. As Greg mentioned, still, industry analysis puts us at roughly 90% of cyber attacks start with a spear phishing campaign. We sort of evolved that spear phishing campaign to be very targeted, that we call whaling. Funny word, but whaling is targeting the big fish in an enterprise because they realize that these big fish, senior executives, have multiple devices, they've got multiple computers, they're running around 15 meetings a day. They're less likely to be paying attention to the nuances in an email or a phone call or a text message than somebody else would in the enterprise who's not as busy. And so that is on the rise. And when we talk to our customers, we tell them that when you're doing a test or training of spear phishing, nobody is immune. IT guys sometimes get scared. They don't want to do a spear phishing campaign against the C-suite because they're scared what the blowback is going to be. But our recommendation is the lowest person in the organization all the way to the senior executive should be tested on a regular basis to see what they're clicking on and see what, what drives them and drives their behavior, because the attack can come from the secretary of the CEO or the CEO.
And just quickly, when we say tests, what kind of tests are they? How involved are they?
They're not very involved, and actually there's great organizations that are providing what we call spear phishing testing and training, which is you hire outsourced company to basically craft various messages and send them to your employees on a very erratic basis, right, over the course of a year. And then you monitor who is clicking on emails, opening them, who is clicking on the attachments, and what they're doing. And then you can start getting an understanding of click rate across your organization. And generally speaking, we still see anywhere from a 10 to 20% click rate in organizations clicking on these emails that look legitimate that are not. At Bluepoint, we test our own organization, and we're a cybersecurity company. And so we routinely send emails to our organization's employees, emails from the CEO that have his name spelled slightly wrong, just to see what our own employees are doing. So those sorts of exercises are available in the marketplace today. There are dozens of companies that offer spear phishing testing and training.
Okay. So is now a good time for firms to bolster their cybersecurity defenses?
Absolutely. It's always a good time, but this is a particularly good time to review everything you're doing from a cyber defense perspective. There's some things we know, depending on what geography you're working in. This could be month 4 or 5 of working from home. And so we've learned a lot. And we should assume that going forward, there's going to be some iteration, some percentage of employees that are going to be working from home. This is for personal reasons, for health reasons, just it's more efficient now that they've gotten into the habit of working from home. So we need to kind of look at cybersecurity strategies and, adopt those to a work from home environment. And some things that, security organizations can do now is they can sunset some obsolete security tools that don't support remote working, or perhaps are long in the tooth and don't really give them the return on investment. Anything to upgrade VPNs or virtual desktop technologies, because this is here to stay. And it also gives you the ability that if we have another wave or another wave or another wave, that you're going to be able to quickly flex that workforce to work from home. And really, as already mentioned by Milan, training and awareness of employees. They're working now isolated, they're at home. They can't push themselves away from the desk and walk down the hall and say, hey, I got this strange email. What do you think? Should I click on the link? You've lost that ability to kind of do peer reviews. So we need to upgrade their knowledge of what these threats are all about. And lastly, any organization that was considering doing multi-factor authentication or bolstering their cloud security environment, now's the time to do that, because the world has changed and we need to adapt ourselves to the new normal.
And I really like the point about, humans being the weakest link. So security training, security awareness really is a great place to start. I also think that having appropriate security policies and procedures are something we need to mention. We've talked about a lot of tools. I think about data loss prevention we talked about earlier. Data loss prevention is a little bit more complicated than just turning on the tools. It really starts with stepping back and determining what it is you want to put in place. And that gets defined in a policy and a procedure. And I think that's true for a lot of these controls. So now's a good time to assess your policies and procedures. Which ones need more work, which ones need more detail. Another great example would be your incident response plan. Do you have a fairly comprehensive incident response plan that's documented, and do you practice it occasionally, which comes back to training and awareness. Third-party vendors, do I have a good vendor management policy, a method outlined for how I'm going to oversee my critical third-party vendors who have access to critical data or running critical parts of my business. So don't forget about those policies and procedures.
And earlier we did get a question about some of the some of the best technologies and things to consider. So this, and as the issue was brought up, what are some of the better technologies that people should keep in mind? Not specific providers, but some of the technologies that firms have not really had to think about before.
I think I can take that. So, it starts with protecting the endpoint, right? Protecting the computer that you're on. There are multiple ways to think about protecting the endpoint. Number one is, do you have the right antivirus? Are you running the latest version of the antivirus? What we commonly refer to as next generation antivirus, which is specifically designed to look for bad behavior, not just bad IP addresses or bad files. So those are important. So if I could leave you with sort of, when you leave this, if you want to go back to your IT team or your IT outsourcer, ask them, what antivirus are we running? Is this the best one? Can we get something better? Show me the tests of the top 5 to make sure we have the right one. The second is what your computer is able to connect to, what the user is able to connect to. We routinely call that DNS filtering, but it's essentially not allowing the user to connect to malicious websites that are known to be malicious or suspicious. And so most organizations take the approach of, well, we're not going to let any one of our employees using a company laptop to connect to a website that's less than 5 days old, meaning it's a brand new website that's been stood up. We're just not going to let our employees connect to it. That goes away when you're not in the office, unless you have the requisite tools to make that software available on the computer itself. So where you connect to impacts your security, and what is protecting your computer, should something get there, is equally important. And I would say those 2 big technologies are really relevant. And the third is probably what we call sort of app-based security, which is essentially the idea of moving past VPN. Today, organizations have always budgeted, roughly 15% or 20% of the workforce being remote, traveling, and needing to connect to the corporate network. But what we found was overnight, when everybody went home, organizations looked at their VPN and realized that the hardware, software subscription they bought, or even the internet connection they had, wasn't big enough to support 1,000 people being outside the office and trying to connect the services inside the office. And what we found was organizations were dropping their VPN and letting their employees just connect to get the data. And when you add in the cloud, and you're now connecting to the cloud where there's less visibility on behalf of the customer or on behalf of the actual user, you start thinking about how do you control employees and what they connect to. So there's a new breed of technologies available in the marketplace, things like zero trust, that make sure that the person connecting is the real person. They're on the right computer, they have the right certificates before they connect to a cloud environment where you may have sensitive documents in a Dropbox or a Box account. Those things we're seeing a huge rise in customers asking for that type of technology.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, and if I could, Eugene, maybe just piggyback on Milan's list, which is a great list. There's one other category called risk monitoring and management, or RMM tools, that we're seeing emerge in financial services, especially in an environment where a home office is responsible for independent, contractors, advisors out in the field. And so RMM tools allow you to put an agent on a desktop or a phone or a mobile device, and then the RMM tools will ensure that appropriate security controls are in place and configured on the device. So it'll make sure there's a password, it'll make sure there's antivirus, anti-malware, it'll make sure that there's a current operating system with all the security patches. And the RMM tools actually will report the information, back to the owner of the device as well as the home office. But it's a great way for a home office to kind of keep track of the devices that are out there accessing the firm's systems and the firm's data. It's also another way you can keep inventory information in the home office about the devices that are accessing your environment. There's a number of big players in the industry that provide RMM tools. In fact, just put another little plug in here for FINRA's website. FINRA actually last year went to the marketplace and we interviewed a number of RMM providers. and we identified four providers who have agreed to give preferred pricing to FINRA firms. And so if you go out to our website, you can find the information on those four firms. And I think it's a great control in this remote environment where everybody's working from home to help home offices kind of keep their arms around all those remote devices out there.
And Mari, looks like we have another question.
Yeah, sorry, we had a follow-up to that from the audience. If an asset manager is entirely cloud-based, Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Office 365, Dropbox, et cetera, is it best for the manager to hire a third party to pen test? Would you actually pay a white hat to attack Amazon Web Services?
Yeah, I mean, I'll weigh in on this because we deal with a lot of FINRA firms that are all in the cloud. And my answer is definitely, because, you know, what Amazon provides is the environment, and they do have a number of security controls, but they really leave it up to you to design and implement those controls. And so I think what a pen tester is going to do is come in and, you know, look at how you've configured your environment in the Amazon cloud just to make sure that it's, you know, it's secure and that you don't have any vulnerability.
What is a pen test for those of us who don't know what it is?
The penetration test, that's where you emulate the activities of an attacker using their tactics and tools to be able to see if you have any vulnerabilities that can be exploited.
Okay.
And I can tell you that all of the cloud providers, including AWS, they have a process where you can go online and request authority to do a penetration test against an environment. It's a checklist type of an affair, but they give you clearance to be able to test your own network. So if you engage a third party to do that, they just need to make sure that they go through that approval process before they start their testing. But it is a great idea to test your cloud environment by all means.
Okay. All right. Along those lines, are firms learning, you know, are they learning and improving their protection against hackers and others, you know, during this process? And I know it's only, it's several months in, but it does feel a little longer than a few months. But are firms learning?
Yeah, and I think this is great. You know, I think generally the answer is yes. You know, firms are learning. They want to do what they need to do to protect the sensitive information that they are responsible for. And you know, some of the areas that kind of jump out to me where I've seen firms learning, adopting, making changes. You know, one area is just around operational processes. So if you think about the way you review and you approve a wire request or a withdrawal request, you know, a lot of firms have learned in this environment that they have to enhance their procedures. Great example is whether or not you take a wire request or wire instructions via an email. And if you do, how do you review and approve that? You know, with all the fraudster account takeover that happens out there, you need to have a good review and approval process. In some cases, you know, firms have allowed the registered rep or the advisor to be the reviewer and the approver. And they found that that doesn't always work well. And so home offices have enhanced their back office processes. If it's a wire request above a certain dollar amount, in addition to a registered rep calling the client, the investor, and confirming the wire instructions, somebody in the back office will call just to make sure, you know, that it is in fact the client and it isn't a fraudster. You know, another example would be password reset. So how do you handle password resets for some of your critical applications? You know, fraudsters are all over password resets. You know, the days of where you could verify somebody by the sound of their voice in a call center and then reset their password, you know, that's no longer valid. So we see a lot of firms going through all of their internal processes and just enhancing them, tightening them down, making them more secure, just in reaction to the fraudsters getting smarter and everybody working remotely. So it definitely would suggest that. And the one other thought that comes to mind for me, and it's one that has been a theme during our discussion today, and that just comes back to the training and security awareness. You know, in this environment, everybody working remotely, You can't do enough phishing testing, as Milan was talking about. You can't do enough security awareness. If you have an incident in your environment, send an email out, let people know what happened. And, at least in general terms, you don't have to give all the specifics, but just try to keep awareness really high right now. And we see a lot of firms doing that as well.
Mm-hmm. A quick question for Milan and actually everybody. What pandemic lessons can be applied to ongoing operations? And then along with that, are cyber and ops teams working more closely together than ever before?
I would say lessons learned is maybe an easy one. I think, the word is getting played out because of media, but the new normal is this. The largest companies in the world are talking about working from home permanently. Multi-100,000 organizations. And so what does that mean to everybody else if these large organizations are doing it? And so we're going to have to get used to being home. And really the lesson is, now that you're home and you're in an environment where it's work and personal, the likelihood of cross-pollination between your digital life on social media at home and your digital life at work have a higher chance of intersecting. And so there's really easy things you can do that we haven't seen people do, which is look at all your social media accounts, all your email accounts. Most of the major public providers provide a wizard checklist on privacy. Do you want to turn off location services? Do you want to turn off history of where you've been searching? All these things that are super relevant to security, what I call digital exhaust, which is you create a lot of noise by being online. You don't realize it, but you're creating a lot of noise. And so thinking through what that means to you and how much privacy you want directly impacts cybersecurity. The less you're out there, the less you're likely to be attacked, which is simple things like, are you using a work email address for your LinkedIn profile? It should be a personal email address. The personal email address should have two-factor authentication. Your LinkedIn profile should have two-factor authentication. And if you get an email for a LinkedIn invite to your work email, it's most likely bad because that email is not linked to your in-mail in LinkedIn. So lots of little things that we want to see more adoption of, given that all these solutions are now available for the lowest common denominator, non-technical person to go through, meaning a non-cybersecurity person can go through the Google wizard to check up on their privacy. And we encourage everybody to do that, including your family members who live in the house that are connected to the same internet connection. And so in our house, with my children, I have their computers controlled on what they can access, where they can go, also how long they can use it, because that's always important. But it's critical because they're impacting my security because my laptop's on my home network, on the same router. And so I need to make sure that they don't visit a site and download something and infect our home network. So I would say lessons learned, those are the things that should be done, and you can do them very easily with no real technology prowess.
Okay. Does anyone else want to chime in? Well, because Joe, you had mentioned before about the burn ops teams working together.
Yeah, the users are going to do whatever they possibly can to get the job done. And sometimes that brings in some pretty bad behavior. Something that we've heard that a lot of folks are doing is they can't print from their office machine because of the policies are all locked down. So they'll forward information to a personal machine, which is connected to the home network, and then print it out. And depending on how your data loss prevention policies are set up, you might or might not catch this. But what happens is if that's sensitive information, that's going to reside on that personal machine. That's going to stay in memory. It might even get saved to the hard drive of that machine. And then you have a significant security vulnerability. But like I say, users will do whatever it takes to get the job done. And sometimes that's a smartphone. Sometimes it's an iPad. It's whatever they're going to do so they can get through and get on to the next thing. And that's where both ops and the cybersecurity team need to be in lockstep on that to catch it, stop it, re-educate the users, and keep that risk from happening.
Okay, quickly, Maureen, you've got another question?
Yes, they want to know what's everyone's view on cybersecurity insurance?
That's a great question. I'll take that first, and I'm sure others have comments. So we see this all the time, both with customers complaining about the cost of cyber insurance, but in general, cyber insurance is a very good idea. You should really understand your policy, find the right broker that knows how to deal with it. On top of policies, you should also have an outside counsel that's knowledgeable in data privacy and data breach issues. Not all lawyers are trained in cyber and cyber privacy, but I would say fundamentally very important to any business to have some sort of cyber insurance. But equally important is to understand that what the cyber insurance covers. Like any policy, no insurance company's excited to pay a claim, and so there's always little loopholes to get out of paying for a full recovery. So thinking through business disruption, credit monitoring, to the extent you have information for your customers that is deemed PII, and some of that data is either lost or not proven. What's not proven to be lost. What's also important there is the intersection of cyber insurance and statewide policies on cyber privacy and data privacy. Each state does things differently, what they consider a breach and what they don't. In some states, the mere fact of evidence of a compromise in a machine, even though you can't prove anything was taken, could justify and trigger privacy issues and litigation issues. So I would say number one is absolutely have privacy, but understand what the sort of nuances are on business disruption, cost of the breach itself, repairing the breach, recovery costs, and other costs that go along with recovering from the cyber breach. And then also the last thing I'll say is don't confuse having risk mitigation as part of a cyber insurance policy to not have adequate coverage. We hear customers all the time say, well, if I have cyber insurance, so what's the worst that can happen, right? I'll get a claim filed. And the reality is, it's almost like, having some insurance for your house, but not having fire detectors and smoke alarms in your house because you think you're covered because you got cyber insurance. And so I would say have it, know what it is, know what its limitations are, and don't confuse it for having adequate security.
Eugene, we released, go ahead, Greg.
No, okay. I'll just real quickly add that as we work with FINRA firms, we usually ask if they have cybersecurity insurance. We're seeing more and more firms that do. Milan, covered very well. Make sure you know what you have. I would just add, though, that the industry has matured. The providers are more sophisticated. Meaningful cybersecurity insurance is only going to be provided after they do an assessment of your cybersecurity program. And so, make sure you understand what you have and what the limits of it are. And I've also seen a couple of firms who really were saved financially by the fact that they had a cybersecurity insurance policy in place. These are smaller firms that otherwise, without that payment, may have been out of business.
So Eugene, we just released a couple of weeks ago a pretty comprehensive research report about cyber insurance. And we talked to dozens of brokers, insurers, and end users about cyber insurance. And we found a lot of misconceptions, and we saw a lot of change in cyber insurance. And it's mostly due to litigation. So there's ongoing litigation, companies like Mondelez and Maersk, and even the old Target breach from years ago, which are stuck in the courts because of the notion of what's called silent cyber, where they believe that they were covered for cyber outages or business interruptions on a normal insurance policy, but they didn't have specific cyber insurance. So this is becoming a debate between the courts, the insurers, the brokers, and the end users. And so what we did is, as part of that research, we released a checklist for chief information security officers to be able to review cyber policies and ask the right questions before the policy is issued. So there's a lot of misunderstanding and misconceptions in the market today.
Just jumping onto another subject, should firms be proactive and reach out to regulators when when they're thinking about this issue, and then perhaps even when they encounter a cyber threat?
And so Eugene, I'll take that one. The answer is yes. There's no rule that says you have to, but it definitely is something we suggest, something we recommend, and I think better for everyone involved. If you have a cybersecurity incident, call your risk monitoring administrator, your RMA, and just make them aware of what happened. Better to proactively inform the regulator than to have the regulator come in at examination time and ask, gee, have you had any cybersecurity incidents? And at that point, you report something that happened, 6-12 months ago, kind of a thing. So.
And budgets. There's been a lot of talk about cybersecurity budgets. What is happening with them, and what should happen for the budgets in 2021 and beyond?
Well, Eugene, we just got finished with a pretty comprehensive look at budgets for 20 and 21, where we interviewed chief information security officers, not only in financial services, but also in other industries. And we found that 58% of those CISOs outside of financial services believe that their security budgets are going to be cut. And so that means they're going to really have to scramble to do more with less. Now, financial services, expect to be protected just because of the nature of cyber and the mission for financial services. But still, half of those CISOs believe that their budgets are going to be flat in 2020 and 2021. And that means they're going to have to do some pretty clever things and hope that savings in other areas like real estate and travel and office amenities are going to refill those budgets. But that's not guaranteed today. There's a lot of unknown and a lot of uncertainty. But some things they're going to have to do is they're going to have to cross-train their employees. They're going to have to make sure that employees can cover multiple roles and plug in to different places instead of expecting to go out and increase their headcounts. They're going to have to eliminate some of these tools I mentioned earlier that are no longer effective. And this is a great time to go to the CIO and to go to the capital committees and say, we really need to get off of these old applications and operating systems that we're trying to secure. Let's upgrade to the latest versions and drop what we call compensating controls. Mm-hmm. These are all things they're going to have to do because the budget picture is very murky right now.
Mm-hmm. And just quickly, a follow-up. Is it possible that some of these former hackers could be hired, and are they good to help with a firm to develop a cybersecurity defense?
Milan, that's for you, I think.
Milan is smiling, but that is, I just was wondering.
So I would, that's a tough one. So funny story, I arrested somebody 10 years ago and ran into them 2 years ago, and they were working at a threat intelligence company after they served prison time. So everybody can be redeemed. But I would say, looking at consultancies first, they generally have the ability to hire really top-notch operators from the government that have gone to the private sector, from the NSA, the FBI, and others. And so there's a lot of great firms out there that perform great technical penetration testing, vulnerability analysis from the perspective of an attacker. But I would consider them the good guys. I leave it up to you guys if you want to go hire somebody that was in trouble hacking. While very good, you may not be able to keep them as a full-time employee.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So lastly, is there anything I didn't touch on that that the panel thinks is important? Okay.
And the only thing I would add real quickly, and Joe touched on this earlier, is when it comes to account authentication, if you have a system that doesn't have two-factor authentication in place and there's critical client data or critical business service provided, you really need to put two-factor authentication on it. Not that two-factor authentication can't be broken, but it really makes it a lot harder to take over accounts. So,
okay, all right, Marin, I think we've come to the end of our hour.
Great. Yeah, Joe had to jump to a client call, but I want to thank you all for participating today. Thank you so much, Greg and Milan, and to Joe, who had to hop off. I think that was a very interesting discussion, and we had some great questions from the audience. This discussion will be recorded, so if you wanted to watch back again, or you had a colleague that you think would benefit from listening, you can still have them register. And we thank everybody who joined us today. Next week's episode, we're going to be talking about keeping up with UMR reform. The UMR deadlines have been moved, also related to the pandemic, which we've also covered in detail on FTF News. So it might not be for this audience, but we hope to see you next week or a future episode. But